Description: Ywain, a knight bored with his administrative duties, abandons his estate to his younger brother and goes on a pilgrimage to seek his heart's desire. Following a will-o'-the-wisp resembling a child, his quest takes him to the city of Paladore, where he meets the Lady Aithne, half-fae enchantress. Sir Henry Newbolt's allegorical fantasy was published in hardback in Britain in 1914 and in the United States a year later. It was revived in 1975 as the fifth volume in the celebrated Newcastle Forgotten Fantasy Library. Enjoy listening to the audiobook.
Part 6 of Aladore by Henry Newbolt. Chapters 16 to 18. Chapter 16. How Ywain found his lady again, and how she went from him the second time. Long time was Ywain musing on that which had befallen him by night, and it seemed to him that he had been made to live, as it were, in two lives, seeing that out of one sleep he had twice awakened. And of the truth of this he had no certainty, but of his service that he had sworn to his lady, of that he had certainty, for whether in his dream or out of his dream his heart assented thereto. Moreover, he desired greatly to come again to that house where he had seen her go from him, and if such a house there were in Paladore, he doubted not to find it, for he saw yet before his eyes the shield of arms that was there beside the door, and it was party of sable and silver, with the ship sailing therein counter-coloured. But now, while he was musing, came a messenger from Sir Rainald, and entreated him of his courtesy that he would be with Sir Rainald shortly, for he had that to say to Ywain which was worth his hearing. So Ywain went with the messenger and came to Sir Rainald. Then Sir Rainald spoke to him slowly and with many words, as men speak of grave matters. And he told Ywain how he was commanded to bring him that same day before the Prince of Paladore, and he gave him joy therewith, for he said that the honour was great, and such as fell not commonly to them that were strangers, but if they were on some embassage. Then Ywain thanked him in such words as were fitting, and so covered his thought, for in his old life he had had knowledge of princes, and he was well away weary even to remember them. Yet for the desire that he had to meet again with his lady, and to do her service, he was willing to pleasure Sir Rainald and the prince and any other. So, when an hour had been set that he should meet with Sir Rainald before the door of the great guard, then Ywain took his leave and was gone until the evening. At first he came hastily to his own house, for before any other thing that he might do, he was set to find that house of the shield, and he thought to go by the way of his dream. And he found the way like as he remembered it, and came before the house and saw the shield. And he entered into the house, for the door was unlatched, and there was no man to stay him or to answer him. Yet he entered not so easily, for the door stood heavy against his hand, and cried out upon him, and he perceived that the hinges of it were eaten with old rust. Also upon the inward side of it was much cobweb of spiders, and in the hallway dust like grey sand upon the flags. Then he went from chamber to chamber, and they were all wide and waste in like manner. And his eyes were darkened to look upon the place, and his heart was cold within him, for he saw it as a place of the dead that was mouldering and forgotten. Then at last he came into a little chamber that was high above the hall, and it was the chamber of all the house that was most richly hung and furnished, and in it was a lute and a book, and a frame of broidery, and upon the wall a round mirror of glass. And he came to the mirror and stood still to look into it, and when he looked, the blood leapt in his heart as a horse leaps to the spur, for in the glass was the chamber made small and clear, as it were far off, and all things in order as he had seen them, save only that before the frame of broidery he saw a lady sitting at the work, and for all the bending of her head and the shadow upon her, he knew well that she was his own lady, and he kept watch upon her where he stood, for to move him from the mirror he dare not, lest she should go from him again. Then he saw in the glass how she raised her head and looked, and in that same instant the mirror was filled with cloud, and he turned him swiftly about in great fear. But his fear was vain, for his lady was verily there before him sitting, and by her the book and the lute, and all things in the chamber. And she gave him no greeting, but bent still to her broidery, and made as though he had been long time there with her. And presently she bade him take the lute and sing thereto, and her voice was light and careless, as of one that thought most of her own business. Then he was ashamed, for he had no skill with the lute, and he prayed her forgiveness humbly. Then she said it was no matter, but that he should take the book and read to her. And he took the book and opened it, but every word that was in it was written in an unknown tongue, so that he was ashamed for this time also. Then again she said it was no matter, but for a little while she was silent, and afterward she bade him look from the window and tell her of that which he saw. So he came to the window, that was an oriel and high above the ground, and before it and beneath lay the ridge tiles of the city, and beyond them was a wall with battlements, and above the battlements was a long line and dim, where the sky met with the sea. Then he said to his lady, I see some part of the city hereunder, and what shall I say of it to do you pleasure? But she answered him that he should look not upon the city but beyond it. Then he said to her, I see above the battlements a dimness of blue, and in it is a line where the sky meets with the sea, and what more shall I say of it to do you pleasure? And she answered him not, but left her broidering, and so came and stood beside him at the window. And they two looked upon the sea together, and at the last she said to him, Look well now, and tell me all, for I see that of which you have not told me. And he looked again, shading his eyes with his hand, and peering carefully, but nothing could he see, save one dimness upon another. Then an evil thought came into his mind, and he said within himself, This is her will, to put shame upon me, and to make me speak of that which I see not, as though I saw it with my eyes. Then he looked once again, and as he looked he spoke, and in his voice was a little grain of anger, as small as the sand that grits between the teeth. And he said, I see nothing where nothing is. And in that instant he heard his lady sigh, there as she stood beside him, and sorrow came upon him to hear her, and he would have turned to yield himself. And he turned and found her not, for in the taking of a breath she was gone from him. Chapter 17. Of Aladore, and of the sands called the Shepherdine Sands. Then Ywain groaned inwardly, for he said, I am a fool, and worse than a fool, and for a moment he hated himself and all that he had done. But afterward he considered a little and said, This comes not of folly but of newness, for I have not been used to live in two several lives. Yet by all seeming my lady does even so, and I with her. Therefore she knew well that I was her sworn servant, dream in and dream out, and if I had bethought me of this, I had never been angry. But now I have offended the second time, and how I am to meet with her again I cannot tell, seeing that she comes and goes like the wind among the leaves. So he went down to the house and out of it, and set his face to go toward the sea, for he thought by carefulness or by good hap he might come to perceive that which before had been hid from him. And as he went he heard one call him by his name, and he looked about and saw the young man Hubert behind him coming quickly. And he stayed for him, so that they went forward together, and as they went they talked. And this time also Hubert told Ywain all such things as he demanded to know, for whether feasting or fasting, he was ever the same man, and his speech was restless and joyful. And at first Ywain asked him of the house of the shield, wherefrom he had come, and Hubert said it was of old the house of Sir Oger, but now of his daughter, the Lady Aithne, for Sir Oger was by his own outrageousness drowned and dead. And of the Lady Aithne He said that she was beautiful beyond telling, and therein Ywain well believed him, and then he said that she came never there, but hated them of Paladore, and forsook them utterly. And Ywain laid that saying by, that he might ponder it. Then in their talking they came to the wall of the city, and Ywain saw before him a gate that he knew not yet, and beside it upon the left hand was a castle and a courtyard, and men afoot with halberds, and men ahorse with swords drawn, and many folk coming and going. And this, said Hubert, is the great guard of the Prince of Paladore, and it lies against the wall of the city and overtops it, and so runs a good furlong to the south. But on the east it stands above the city, and looks down into it, as a tree may stand above a sheepfold. Yet not so in truth, for in what place a tree stands, there will it look down on this side and on that, and not on one side only, as it is with this guard of theirs. Therewith he brought Ywain to the gate, and so out of the city. And he turned about and showed him that on this side the face of the great guard was as it were blind, and in no way looked upon the sea. And Ywain was astonished thereat, for the place was passing beautiful, with a broad way beneath the wall, and a border of great trees, and between the trees the wide water, coloured diversely with green and purple colours. Then he looked out as far as eye might see, and as he looked he forgot Hubert and remembered Aithne, for he longed greatly to know what was the thing which she had perceived and he not. Then he turned back in his thought to Hubert and asked of him, "What place is this, and for what reason so forsaken?" And Hubert answered, "Well it is that you ask this of me and of none other, for the place is called the High Steep of Paladore, and it is not forsaken but forbidden. For in Paladore the sea is held for a dread thing and an evil, and the great ones, and those of the tower and those of the prince's household, will have it neither in sight nor in hearing, so that it is not so much as named with us, save now and then with women, or else with harpers and rhymers and the like." Then Ywain said, "Without doubt you make mirth of me, for I perceive that you are speaking one thing and thinking of another, as men use in jesting." But Hubert said, "There is no mirth in the matter, save it be the mirth that covers aching bones, for at times we have sight from hence of that which in all the world we most desire, and well begone is he that sees it. Yet for this desire are we shamed and slighted, as children are hushed that speak foolishly among their elders." "But what see you," said Ywain, "or what desire you to see?" And therewith his heart began to go to and fro, for he knew that he was near his lady's secret. Then Hubert laughed a little, and made as though he would answer him, but he answered him as it were slantwise. For he said, "Their shame is a toothless dog." And again he said, "They see but little that never see Aladore." Then of a sudden he changed his manner of speaking, and went laughing and talking at great random, whereby Ywain perceived that he had done with that matter, and would have no more of it, until he should return into his former mind. So Ywain took counsel with himself to lay wait for him there, seeing that it behoved him greatly, for his lady's sake, to hear tell of Aladore. Then they two left the way under the wall, and passed out between the trees, and they cast themselves down upon the grass, and lay there for a space, looking towards the sea, and below them where they lay was the high steep, grey and green, and below the steep was a beach upon the margent of the water. And as for the water, that was of two kinds, for nigh land it was unvexed and still, as a deep river is still, but a mile out it was broken and foam-flocked, as it were a great green meadow, and 1,000 of white sheep thereon, and so continued as far out as eye could see. And Ywain marvelled to see the breaking of the water, for there was no wind, and the tide was well nigh silent upon the strand. And Hubert told him that it was no marvel, for the water inshore was deep, so that a ship might go thereon. But out yonder, he said, no man may sail and keep his life, for the sea is full on every side with banks of sand, and the name of them is called the Shepherdine Sands. and many a one have they covered from all sight and seeking."
Then said Ywain,
"They are well named by the name of the Shepherdine Sands, for I see the sheep plainly. But tell me this, for what sake any man should go among them to peril of death?" And Hubert said, "For the sake of Aladore." Then Ywain thought to anger him that he might be the more certainly answered. So he spoke scornfully and said, "What manner of men are they that for such a sake will go to peril of death?" But Hubert was no whit angered, and he said joyfully, "Well worth the peril and the death, for they tell such tales of Aladore that if but the half of them be true, then may it well be the land of every man's desire. And this you believe not yet, for you have not seen it, nor can I tell you on what day or by what enchantment you may come to see it. For a man may watch half his life in vain, and suddenly in the lifting of his eyes it will be there, between sea and sky, as clear as stone in sunlight." Then, when he heard this, Ywain was silent for a space, and continued looking out to seaward. But he saw there nothing that was new, for he saw only the still water near him, and afar off the blue border of the sky, and between them he saw that pasture perilous of the Shepherdine Sands. Chapter 18. Of Paladore and of the princes thereof. Right so came the sound of trumpets from within the battlements, and Hubert started up upon his feet, and said joyfully how it was the trumpets in the great guard blowing to hall. And he made Ywain also to rise up and go with him, and he brought him again through the gate and into the city, and so to his own lodging. And there Hubert would have Ywain to dine with him, and with certain others. And of those others one was named Maurice, and another Bartholomew, and the third Dennis. And they were all three of them young men, and restless in their speech, as was Hubert himself. So they five talked together all the time of dinner, and afterward they rose not from the table, but continued talking. And as reason was, so it happened in their talk, that there was ever one that made question and four that answered, whereby at the last it seemed to Ywain that his head span round, for they four smote him with strange sayings on this side and on that, as boys will smite a top and spin it. And when they had told him the customs of Paladore concerning war and witchcraft and marriage, then they told him of the clergy and the court. And of clergy they said that there was scarce one to be seen in all the city, for the great ones believed them not, and the commons loved them not. Therefore they banished them for the most part, yet not far off, lest evil should come thereby, or some sudden need. But the archbishop they kept still within the city, for he was of the company of the tower, or at the least so they thought of him. And of churches they made no account, but left them there. Yet for the hope of paradise there were many that went pilgrimage. Then they all praised the prince some deal, but of the court they told Ywain such things as men will tell of courts, and in part he believed them, and in part he believed them not, for in his time he also had told the like and found it otherwise. But this much he heard of Maurice and took it for truth, namely that by old custom none could be prince in Paladore, save that he were a giant of his stature and of his lineage. And also must no prince take a wife, save that she likewise came of giants, to the end that the same estate and goodliness might remain unto their children's children. And by this counsel, said Maurice, it came to pass that being no more of one kind with smaller folk, he that was prince could not have ado with his people, neither in battle nor in love. But he had of them great reverence, for all men praised the doing of his lineage in time past. Moreover, upon high days there would go lords before him, bearing a great sword and a crown of tawny, and when they of Paladore saw the prince accompanied therewith, there was then no renown that they would not believe of him. So said Maurice, and Bartholomew laughed and said further, It is true enough, yet this also is true, that our prince is no free man, but lives in durance all his life days. For by no old custom, but belike by fear of his greatness, It is forbidden that he come abroad into the city without he be guarded by armed guards, lest perchance he should sometime break forth and go his own ways. Moreover, it is provided that in his own house also, and whether he be eating or drinking or what else doing, he shall in any case be bound with chains. And in the making of such chains, they of Paladore have great skill, for they will tie a man hand and foot with bonds of no seeming substance, and yet past breaking of any, save he be strongly holpen of friends. Then Dennis laughed also, and he said, Nay, but this one thing you have forgotten, how that our princes have leave for all manner of hunting and fowling, and they go freely into all such forests as are large enough, and strike all such game as shall come near enough. For though they ride not with hounds, lest their horses fall down under so great weight, yet will they stand in coverts the day long with marvellous endurance, to shoot at such few birds and beasts as may be driven forth to them. And this is well done, for in Paladore good hunting brings goodwill, and the prince thereby has the love of all his people. And their love fails not, but increases continually, for they hold this prince that now is to be better than his father, and he also was better, as it is reported, than any that was before him. And certainly in the old time they killed not their game so easily, nor 1/4 part of the number thereof. Then said Ywain, I perceive plainly that this is a good prince, but I am yet to seek wherefore he should desire my presence. And Hubert and Maurice and Bartholomew and Dennis, when they heard Ywain say so, they were astonished, for they knew not of the sending of Sir Rainald, and they ceased from their laughing as men cast suddenly into fear. And Hubert said, This is of the tower, for I know their handiwork of old. Then Ywain said merrily, By seeming, I also am a beast of the game. But they four laughed no more, and Ywain perceived that there was no merriness left in them, for they dreaded the favour of the tower, whereby they might lose their man as soon as they had gained him. And in no long while after, Ywain took his leave of them, and he hastened and came to Sir Rainald, for it was time. End of Part 6. Part 7 of Aladore by Henry Newbolt. Chapters 19 to 21. Chapter 19. How Ywain spoke with the Prince of Paladore, and how he took upon him 3 adventures. So when he had met with Sir Rainald, they two went up together into the great guard, and when they came therein, Ywain perceived that Maurice had told him truth, for the house was high and wide and full of great chambers, and in no way fit to be the dwelling of a man, save he were of a bigness beyond all other. Also he saw that the farther from the gate, the taller were all those on whom he came, and it seemed to him as though he also took some change thereby. For when he had been brought into the chamber that lay before the chamber where the prince was, then he began to doubt of his own stature, and his bones became shrunken and his sinews weak within him. Then came lords unto Ywain and unto Sir Rainald, and put robes upon them, and so led them in. And when they were come in, they found the prince at play, sitting upon the floor at the chamber, and beside him upon the floor were a multitude of toys, fashioned after the likeness of men-at-arms. And he made them go hither and thither as he would, so that it was a marvel to behold. And when he saw Ywain and Sir Rainald, he ceased not from his playing, but he called to them lightly to come on, and take their share in his pastime. And Ywain wondered and looked hard at him, for the words were the words of a child, but he that spoke them was by all seeming a man of 40 year. Then at the last, when he had done with his playing, the prince came to his feet, and he was nothing terrible for all his bigness. Neither was he a child, no, not by some deal, for he asked such questions as they ask that have seen the manner of men and of women also. But he said not many things of his own, nor new things in any sort, and it was plain to see that his bonds wearied him. And Ywain also they wearied, for he could not choose but watch them glittering upon the prince, so that he seemed to bear the burden of them himself. Then the prince brought him to a window that looked upon the city, and he asked Ywain whether it were in his mind to stay in Paladore or to go from thence shortly. Then Ywain remembered his lady Aithne, and he answered quickly that if it pleased the prince he was minded to stay. And the prince was pleased thereat, and he said that he looked for Ywain to take upon him certain adventures, for so did all those that had so much of skill and fortune. And Ywain answered yea, for he loved this prince and thought no evil of him, but he knew not of what adventures he would speak. Then the prince looked at him pleasantly, and he considered a little, as a man considers of diverse meats upon the board, every one of them sweet to his tooth. Then he named to Ywain 3 several adventures that he would have him take upon himself. And he named the first thereof, the adventure of the chess, and the second the adventure of the howling beast, and the third he named the adventure of the castle of maidens. Then it seemed to Ywain as though his stature had returned to him, and he answered lightly that he would take upon him these adventures, and that forthwith. And the prince gave him leave to depart, and said how that he had done well, and should yet do better. And this also was Ywain's thought within himself. But in the same moment he looked upon the face of Sir Rainald, and he saw it as the face of a fox, well pleased with the cunning that he has practised. Chapter 20. Of the adventure of the chess, and by what means Ywain brought his men into obedience. So within a while came letters to Ywain, appointing him a day for the adventure of the chess. And on the day appointed he looked forth from his house, and saw how there stood before the door a company of the great ones, and they called to him courteously, and showed him a horse that was made ready for him. And when he came out to them, they let cover him with a cloak of silver and blue, and they gave him for his head a cap of silver with a plume of blue, and he perceived that his horse was furnished in the like colours. Then they brought him to the gate of the city that looked toward the south, and one of them told him by what way he should go, and how it behoved him to come before noon to the castle of the chess, and so prove the adventure. Also another of them cast a baldric and a horn about his neck, and said how that without doubt it should fortune to him as he should deserve. And if so be that he achieved the adventure, then when he came again he should come blowing upon the horn, that his friends might make ready betimes to meet him. And some there were that laughed thereat, and among their faces Ywain saw the face of Sir Rainald. Then he set forth, and he rode at an easy pace, for the morning was yet hoar with the dew of night and the gossamer upon the grass. And when he had passed over the high land that was before the city, he came to a river, and forded it, and so took the forest, and went by a green road therein. And before noon he was aware of a castle that stood above the forest, and he entered in at the gate of it, and came to the hall, and alighted down from off his horse. And he marvelled at the manner of the castle, for he found none there to stay or to speed him, neither in the gatehouse, neither within guard. Yet was the hall well kept and furnished, with meat and drink on table, and new rushes thereunder. Also there was a great bell above that sounded to dinner without hand or rope, so that it was easy to perceive that the place was enchanted by sorcery. Now when Ywain had well dined, he fell into a study, not knowing what more he was to do, and as he studied, he heard a noise without the hall, but of what the noise might be he could not tell, for it was faint as wind or water. So he arose and went into a bay window that was beside the high table, and there was a great lattice there which stood wide open, and he came to it and looked out. And he saw there a courtyard that lay beneath the window, and the floor of it was checky sable and white, after the fashion of the tables of chess, whereby he knew that he was come to his adventure. And thereby also he perceived the meaning of the noise that he heard, for even as he looked, there came out of a cloister 2 companies apparelled after the fashion of the chess, pawns and bishops and the like, on this side and the other, and they of the other side were all in cloth of gold with red bordures. But they of the side that was Ywain's were all in cloth of silver with bordures of blue, and of the rustling of the cloth of gold and of silver came that noise aforesaid. And other noise was there none, but that only, and the sound of it was like the whispering of the wind in an ambush. Then Ywain looked to see who was he that should play with him, and he saw how that beyond the chequer there was a window opened, over against the window wherein he stood, and in that window was a shadow, and in the shadow a semblance like to the semblance of a man. But between the windows came the sunlight broad upon the chequer, and for the glare of it he had no certainty of that which was within the shadow. Then he saw that the two companies were all in order arrayed upon the chequer, and the game awaiting for him. And he thought how he would send his pawn forward according to the usage. But he spoke no word as yet, for he had no desire to hear his own voice in that place. Nevertheless the pawn moved as he would have it, and immediately a pawn of the gold moved also to meet him, whereby Ywain perceived that the manner of the game was not by speaking but by thinking. And when he thought again to command a piece, then that piece also moved according to his thoughts. Thus began the playing upon this side and upon that, and in the beginning Ywain had the advantage, and he looked presently to have the mastery, but the way thereto was long and tangled, and the end fell suddenly into doubt. For when the time of the stroke was come, Ywain perceived that either his remembrance had failed him in strange wise, or else that he had been undone by a knight of his. For whereas by his intention the knight should have been upon the sable, now he was found upon the white, and so out of distance for the stroke. Then was Ywain in great peril, but he fought warily to recover his game, and rebutted stoutly, and so came again into good hope. But with the misadventure and the doubt, and with the slowness of the playing, the day was well nigh passed over, and the shadow of the battlements crept softly upon the chequer. Then the sun fell more quickly to the high tower of the castle, and was gone behind it suddenly, and a little wind stirred in the coldness of his going. And Ywain saw how the wind caught the gold and silver pieces, as it were in a whirlpool, and it carried them away under the cloister wherefrom they had issued. And they went after the manner of dead leaves, rustling and eddying by no motion of their own. And he marvelled greatly thereat, for he had supposed them to be men like himself, but now he doubted. Then he went to sup and to sleep, and found all things made ready as before. But the silence of the place choked him, and the solitariness lay deathwardly upon his spirit. Yet he remembered how he had that day been near to win his game, and he thought well to amend it on the morrow, and give mate before the time of sunset. But therein his hope deceived him, for again on the morrow his fortune was at odds with his force, and when he came to make his stroke, he was undone by the transgression of his men, so that his battle was disordered until sunset, and the wind right welcome to break off the game. And when he thought thereon, despair came upon him, because he saw that the obedience of his company was not as the obedience of those others. And when he came to his bed, he lay long waking, and he cast every way for counsel, how he might make his thoughts prevail more perfectly. Then in the last hour of the night, he rose up out of his bed, and came softly down into the cloister, to see the truth of the companies, for his mind was so busy that he could not sleep. And when he was come down, the day was breaking, and he found the men all together, the gold with the silver, and they lay this way and that upon the stones of the cloister, even as the wind had drifted them, and by seeming they were light and hollow, like the barren mast beneath a beech tree. Then Ywain stood looking upon them, and as he looked the sun rose, and he saw a marvel, for with the sun rising their life came again into them, and they began to breathe and stir as men breathe and stir in their sleeping. Then he put forth his hand, and touched one and another of them, and when he had touched them all, he perceived that they of the gold party were every one ruddy and warm of flesh, but they of the silver were all white and cold as mushrooms. And in the same instant he knew the truth of their disobedience, for he said within himself, "They fight in my quarrel, but the heat of my blood they lack." Right so he knew what he must do, and he took the hermit's knife that was about his neck, and loosed it from the sheath, and with the point of it he pierced his breast strongly, so that the blood came forth in good plenty. And the pain drew at the roots of his heart, and he came again to them of the silver company, and with his own blood he touched them upon the lips, until he had bebled them all. But the gold ones he touched not, for there was no need. And last of all he touched the queen, and she awoke and rose up, and looked upon him as with remembrance. And she put forth her hand in turn, and touched him upon the breast, and immediately the pain ceased, and the blood was stayed. And Ywain's heart trembled as she looked at him, for beneath her looks he saw his lady's image, as men see faces in the fire. But she let close her eyes again, and turned her from him, and so fell suddenly to her sleep. Then Ywain entered into great meditation, and continued long therein, so that he walked in meditation, and ate and drank the same to his dinner, and came unawares to the hour of the adventure. But when the pieces were now arrayed, and by his thought he began to move them upon the chequer, then he perceived that on this day the game was in his hand, for his men obeyed him with so brisk obedience that he saw them moving before ever he knew that his will was set. Also they went no more from his intent, but kept his ordinance, and came all together to the stroke, whereby the gold company were discomfited, and their king was both checked and mated. Then upon the instant came a wind and thunder and lightning, and Ywain's eyes dazzled therewith. And when he opened his eyes again, the castle was gone from him utterly, with the windows and the courtyard and the chequer, and he stood in a place of rocks upon a green mound of the forest. And there also he saw his horse beside him, saddled and bridled, and upon the saddle bow 2 crowns, a gold and a silver. And he took the crowns and rode lightly towards the city. And when they of Paladore heard his horn, they came forth to meet him as they had said. Nevertheless, the most of them were astonished, and some displeased, for they looked not to have seen him again. And the gold crown they took for the prince, as reason was, but with the silver crown they crowned Ywain, and so brought him cityward. And as they went he fell aweary, and the sun set, and the night rose on Paladore. Chapter 21. Of the adventure of the Castle of Maidens, and how Ywain was counselled to escape therefrom. Now for this adventure Ywain had great honour of all the commons, for there was no sort of fighting that they did not love, and they gave praise above measure to him that could bring men into his obedience. Wherefore they were not willing that Ywain should meet as yet with the howling beast, for by that adventure they had lost many that should have been great men for them. So they went clamouring that he might be assigned a day for the Castle of Maidens, for that was an adventure without pain and without peril, as the most of them deemed. Howbeit others there were that thought otherwise. Then the prince consented to their clamour, being counselled thereto by them of the tower, for they looked to have Ywain either this way or that, and by favour first if it might be so, but if not, then by foul work, as by the beast. So on the 3rd day they came again to Ywain with smooth faces, and they brought him forth to a great castle that was named the Castle of Maidens, and it stood a 3 mile from the city, in a meadow toward the sun rising. And thither resorted all the lords of Paladore, and great part of the commons, by hundreds and by thousands. And in the midst of them went Ywain with the 20 more that were of his company, and these were all young and lusty men of lineage and wealth sufficient, and they took Ywain for their captain and banneret. So they came to the castle anon, and found barriers thereby, and lists set ready, and Ywain and his company went within the lists. and against them there came forth as many others, for to do battle with them. But the custom was that they fought not with weapons of war, but with spears of wood only. For upon the walls of the castle were many maidens, both young and old, and though they might not all be young, yet were they all too tender to look upon wounds and death. And they were apparelled in hoods of clear colours, right joyous and well beseen, like flowers a row upon the wall. And they ceased not from making a high sweet noise among themselves, as it were the noise of swallows upon a ridge tile. Then Ywain and his were armed and came riding merrily to tourney, and they bestirred themselves in the best manner, so that in 1 hour they had the castle yielden and in mercy, for they that kept it fought but for the custom's sake, and had no force to make good their keeping. Then, when he had received the keys, Ywain entered into the castle with all his company, and there the maidens unarmed them, and brought them to hall, that they might eat and drink, and make ready to fulfil all the custom. Now the custom of the castle was this, that whosoever should have the mastery thereof, and enter as by conquest, never might he and his depart again therefrom, save first they should be wedded, every man with a maiden of the castle. And they were all, both men and maids, no better than blindfold, for the manner of their wedding was by lot. And when the time for the lotting was come, the maidens sat together in a gallery, among such as were of their blood and fellowship. And they were all diversely clad in silken gear, no two alike, but every one of one only colour. Then they that had won the castle were brought in before them in coats of silk, and the coats also were diverse and no two alike, but every one of one only colour. And the colours of the maidens and of the men were such as each one pleased, according to their fantasy. And the maidens knew not of the men, nor they of the maidens, how they would make the choice. But when they came in presence, if any were matched in their colours, then those two were wedded together, and so departed from the castle to their own place. Then when Ywain heard tell of the custom, he was vexed with indignation, for he saw how he had been snared unwitting. And he went hither and thither, as it might be a young wolf raging in the net. But all the doors of the castle were barred and bolted, so that there was no escape. Then by chance he came upon an old dame that was there, within a little chamber alone, and he made excuse and would have taken his leave of her, but she called to him and said, "Good sir, what ails you?" And he answered her, "Good madam, what think you? Shall a man be wedded by custom and by chance?" Then she said, So are the most of man wedded, but if you will, verily, it may be that I shall help you therefrom." "Yea, verily," said Ywain, "for I am bounden otherwhere." Then the old dame put forth her hand, and made to give him somewhat, and when he had handled it, he perceived that it was a silken coat, and the colour of it was of black, both within and without. And she said to him, "Take this and abide the lotment, for it is not to be heard of among 1,000,000 of maidens that any hath chosen black for her wedding." Then Ywain considered of her counsel, and saw that it was good, and though it had not been good, yet he could not better it. So he made to leave her, but first he thanked her heartily, and that old dame looked kindly upon him as with remembrance. And Ywain's heart trembled within him, for he saw beneath her looks the image of his lady, as beneath a many old faces may be seen the beauty that was there aforetime. So he went from her to abide the lotment, and as she had said, even so it was, for there was none among the maidens that had black to her colour. Then all were matched save Ywain, and he only was left there unmatched, so that every man might see how he had taken counsel to escape. And some said that he had not wholly achieved the adventure, and others said that he had achieved it twice over, for he had prevailed both without the castle and within. Howbeit they brought him forth with the rest that were all matched and wedded, and they came cityward with a great noise of shouting. And as they went, Ywain fell aweary of them and of their customs, and the sun set, and the night rose on Paladore. End of Part 7. Part 8 of Paladore by Henry Newbolt. Chapters 22 to 24. Chapter 22 of the Adventure of the Howling Beast. Thereafter Ywain continued in weariness, and in despite and anger against the great ones of Paladore, for he perceived how they had devised these adventures of a very purpose, so that they might have him at their will by fellowship or else by treason. Moreover, he longed greatly to see his lady again, and could not, and of such longing also comes weariness, when a man sees time go by and nothing bettered. So Ywain made search in all Paladore, if he might but hear tell of the Lady Aithne, and he found some few that would speak of her, and little he got of them. For one would say how she was gone into a far country, and one how she was ever a wanderer, and thereby they intended no good thing, for their meaning touched on Aladore, howbeit they named not the name. So Ywain went to and fro, and returned continually to the house where he had seen her, and in 3 days he came there 20 times, and at last he thought to lie like a dog before her doorway. Then at this time Sir Rainald sent a messenger to him, and said that in 2 adventures Ywain had done great pleasure to his lord the prince, and he gave him to think that by the achieving of the 3rd adventure he might well establish himself. And Ywain believed him not, for he knew better, but by reason of his despair he made assent, for he cared not what might become of him. So upon the morrow, very early, 2 came and called him forth, and they brought him a horse and an axe, but no gear else. And he went with them, apparelled in the coat and hat of his pilgrimage. Then he asked them of the adventure, and they told him thereof, and the manner of it was that he should enter into a certain park, and hew therein a tree. And the tree might be which he would, but he must hew it within a day and a night, and it must be down before the daybreak. And as for the hazard and the pain of the adventure, they said how that came by the howling of the beast, for at the sound of the axe it would howl beyond endurance, so that none might hear it, and be the man he was aforetime. Now the park was from the city a 2 hours' journey, and there was a high wall about it and a strong gate thereto. And there were some within which were appointed to keep the beast, but they were all deaf men and heard nothing in the world. So they that brought Ywain there unlocked the gate, and they gave him the axe and bade him enter quickly, for they were in haste to be gone. Then he left his horse and entered, and the gate was shut upon him, and he could well hear those men departing, for they rode as men in fear. Then he looked and saw how the park was all full of thickets, very dark and tangled of old growth, and he went forward slowly, lifting high his feet. And as he went it bechanced that he struck his axe against a tree, and wounded it chipwise. And immediately there came a noise beside him, like the growling of a great hound, and therewith a fear took him that was like a fear out of childhood, for it was quicker than thought and more deep within him. And he looked all ways and saw nothing, and he listened and heard the beating of his heart. Then he went forward again, and found a place that was open ground, and it was a green valley between the thickets, and in the midst of the valley stood a goodly elm tree. Yet was the goodliness of it by semblance only, for within bark it was long since gone and rotten. And Ywain came to the elm tree, and struck it wilfully, for he was there in a clear field, and thought to see the truth of the matter. But in his stroke his senses departed from him, for there came a noise behind him such as he heard never in all his days, no, nor dreamed thereof in an evil dream, for it was like the roaring of a wild bull, and like the howling of a dog upon a grave. And when he heard it, his life turned black within him, and his heart was angered even to madness. And he swung his axe and struck the tree haphazard, as a man may strike that is blinded in battle. And his fear was greater than his courage, and his anger was greater than his fear. So he went smiting, and his hands were bruised and his body shaken. And the beast howled even more loud, and the rage of it pierced Ywain's heart and broke it utterly. For when he heard that sound, it seemed to him that he was hated of all men, and of himself also. And he felt his life perishing into dust, as the grain perishes between the millstones. And his strength went from him momently, so that in no long time he had been mad or dead, save only for the help wherewith he was holpen presently. For in his misery there came to him a sound of clear music, as a lantern comes to a child that is lost in darkness. And the music was of a reed only, yet there was within it a voice singing that was as plain as words. For as Ywain heard it, he thought on old and noble wars, and he remembered in his heart the names of them which had renown therein, and he feared no more to be hated, for he had part with them. And therewith the howling of the beast became faint and without meaning, as a noise that is very far off. And Ywain's strength came again to him, and he hewed with might and with measure, and in 100 strokes he felled the tree endlong. Then with the fall of that tree the noise of howling ceased, and Ywain looked and saw that he had been long in his madness, for it was now the last hour of the day. And the music that he heard ceased not, but the voice changed within it, for it sang no more of old things but of new. And as he heard it, Ywain forgot all the ills that he had suffered in all his life, and he thought on such a place as might be the land of his desire, and it seemed to him that he was not far therefrom. Then his thought went from him, and he slept. And when he awoke it was grey dawn, and he rose up and began to go from that place. And as he went, there met him a herd girl with a herd of black swine, and in her hand was a little pipe of wood. And when Ywain saw the pipe, he remembered how he had been holpen overnight. Then he thought to ask of the herd girl what might be the music which had come to him, and she held up her pipe before him and said, "Sir, there is here no music but of this only, for here are none but deaf men, and I that pipe to the deaf. But whither you go there is music enough, for you will go as I think by the high road." And therewith she left him and went further. But as she went she looked again at him, and she smiled as with remembrance. And in her smiling he saw his lady the third time. Yet he saw her not to his profit, but as a man may see an image in a glass, which is certainly of the world visible, but in no wise of the life thereof. So he looked only and let her go from him. Chapter 23. How Ywain emprised to go to the city of the saints, and so into the delectable isle. So within a while he came to the gate, and found it wide open, and when he had passed out, he looked towards Paladore. For they which brought him thence had spoken of a day and a night, and they said how they would return again thereafter, if perchance they might find him still in life and understanding. And as he looked he saw far off a company that moved upon the road hitherward, but he perceived that they came not a horse but a foot, and they were not two but many. Also they were banded in good order as they came, and kept measure, foot by foot, and they sang all together, and that which they sang was a godly hymn, but it was some deal fierce in the singing. Then Ywain stood still to mark their passing, but they left him not so, for when they were now going by him, he saw among them the young man named Bartholomew, that was friend to him in Paladore. And Bartholomew had sight of Ywain also in the same instant, and he ceased from his singing and ran out of the company, and came to Ywain and took him by the two hands, and he entreated him to be of the company and to go with them. And Ywain was little loath, for he saw how their backs were turned on Paladore, and he cared not greatly whither where he went, so only he went not to that city. So he gave Bartholomew neither nay nor yea to his entreaty, but he began to go with him slowly, following behind the company. And as they went, Ywain began to ask of him to what place they were going and on what adventure. And Bartholomew answered him quickly, and said how that it was no adventure, but a high emprise, sounding in life and death, yea, of their very souls. For they were aweary of Paladore, and misdoubted of all the customs there, seeing how they were hard customs with no kindness or godliness in them. Also he said how that in all the world there might no peace be found, save only in the city of the saints, and that was by report far off and beset of many enemies. Yet were they vowed both to come thither and to dwell therein, if by endurance and good hope they might achieve their vows. Then Ywain asked him, Whence then hath the city this peace? And Bartholomew said, The report of it is diverse, for some men say of it that it cometh by one way, and some by another. At first by conquest, for they that dwell there do continually subdue their enemies, but this to my thinking is a doubtful saying. And secondly, as some have said, it cometh by hope of reward, for the people of the saints trade thence into the delectable isle, where a man may have all that he will, whether of gold or of ivory. And this also, said Bartholomew, I take for profit rather than for peace. But the third way is by good ordinance, for in that city they follow not their own will, nor strive amongst themselves, but every one to serve another. Also they do nothing waywardly, but all things by rule and governance. And for this peace I long both by day and by night. Then, as he heard him, Ywain was kindled a little, and he said within himself, I also am aweary and would serve another, and not myself. And whether all this be true I cannot tell, but as I guess it is an old report that has walked in wandering. For what is this delectable isle wherein a man may have all his desire, if it be not that Aladore which I am to look for over sea? And who knows but I may come thither and find my lady and my love? But to Bartholomew he told nothing of his musing, only he took him by the arm and said that he would go with him and see this city. And therewith he pressed his arm in token of fellowship, for he drew near to him in spirit because of his voice, and because of the words which he had spoken. Chapter 24. How Ywain saw the city of the saints the first time, and how he heard the bells thereof. Now was Ywain once more upon pilgrimage, yet he had not that joy which he had aforetime when he left his house of Sulney. For then he went of his own free will, and followed after the boy that was no stranger to his blood. But now he was lonely and without desire, and though he had somewhat to seek, yet his going moved rather from despair. Also the sky was changed above him, for the year began to leave summer and to turn towards winter, and the green was brown and the brown yellowing, and the nights coldened and the days drew in. Moreover, Ywain walked not so willingly with all his company, for some of them were but ale knights which had repented them when they were a drunken, and some were swashers home from war, and others there were which loved anguishment above all, and being feeble goers would make themselves yet feebler with peasen underfoot and hairy shirts and body cords about them. Neither were they wholly at one in their emprise, for the half of them were in hope to be at rest in the city of saints, and the other half to be speedily at war against their enemies, so that many times when they sang, their singing was diverse, and their fellowship most like to go a grief. And in no long time this came to pass. For when they were 10 days gone upon their way, they that were angriest among them departed from the feeble ones, and they set off across country at great random, saying how they would take the city by assault and keep it against all others. Then they that remained went every day slower and more slow, and though they had all one weariness, yet had they not all one mind, for they fell into much doubt and dispute concerning their two guides, whereof the one was a young lad that knew but little of that country, and the other was an old man and blind these many years. So at the last they were severed again into 2 bands, and went their ways. For they that went with the youngling said how they would build a new city and forsake the old. But Ywain and a 5 or 6 more went not with them, for Bartholomew entreated Ywain against his will. Then they set forward again, and came to a country of hills. And before they entered upon the hills, the old blind fell a-dying that was their guide. And they found a warm village under the hills, and left him there, for it was plain to see that his time was come. Then Ywain and Bartholomew thought to go their way, to find the city or to end in seeking it. But they that had come so far would go no farther with them, for they were afeard to leave their guide, or living or dead. So these twain entered alone upon the hills, and came through them in 3 days. And when they had passed through, they saw the city there below them, and it lay in the midst of a plain, upon a hill that was but a great mound, with a river thereby like silver flowing. And the sea was fast by beneath the sun setting, and the river went thereto through meadows and through boskage. Then Ywain and Bartholomew came down towards the foothills, and drew nearer to the city. And when they were upon the foothills, they saw it over against them in marvellous wise. For the walls of it were of a white old age, with great bastions between all rounded. And before the walls were meadows, and above them were massy trees. And within the city the roofs were of red and of grey, and among the roofs were spires and domes and high towers innumerable, and Ywain saw them all clearly against the sky, and they were all passing beautiful, and not one of them like another. And there lay upon the city an enchantment, like to a mist or dimness upon it, for to such as stood without, and looked upon it, and beheld the walls and the gardens and the high towers thereof, it seemed ever to be abiding in ancientry and peace, as of no earthly city, but to those within it showed after another fashion. And while Ywain and Bartholomew stood still, looking upon the city, the sun set, and dusk came round about them, and in the dusk they saw a glimmering of lights, and they perceived that in that city was full plenty of chapels and of halls, for on every side there were great windows, and in the windows were many lights shining, rich and orderly, window by window a line upon the darkness. Also they heard suddenly a ringing of bells, so many and so sweet to hear that they were astounded with the harmony of them, for they sounded one under another, as it might be under deep and shallow water. And there was one great bell which donged below all other, and the sound of it came up to Ywain like a sound from the bottom of the sea. End of Part 8.
Part 9 of Aladore by Henry Newbolt. Chapters 25 to 27. Chapter 25. Of the manner of the city, and how Ywain fell a-drowsing therein. Ah, said Ywain, what is this city, and by whom builded? For it is certain that I never came here until now, and yet there is not one tower of it that I do not know of old time. And Bartholomew answered him not, but out of the dusk a voice came and answered him, saying, Good truth and good reason, for this city was builded from the beginning, and all men are by nature free thereof, so that come they what day they will, they come not as strangers, but inheritors. Then Ywain saw a man before him, standing, habited after the fashion of the religious, and he saw him gladly, for he took comfort in the words that he had spoken. And Bartholomew was comforted also, for he had been in doubt how they should come that night into the city, seeing that by likelihood the gates would be shut and guarded. And he took the man by the hand and entreated him that he would make good his saying. And he told him how they were of Paladore, come hither by reason of weariness, and how they were by name, Ywain and Bartholomew. And he answered them, yea, but they should have new names for a new life, for he also had in the world a name worldly, but was now become Vicentius, and prayed daily against remembrance of things past. Then Bartholomew said, Aye, and Ywain spoke no word, but his lips trembled. And Vincent looked upon their two faces, and he perceived the diversity of them, for he read them as the pages of a book. And he said to Bartholomew, "What look you to find here?" And he answered, "Peace." And Vincent said to him, "It is well." Then he asked of Ywain also the same question, and Ywain said openly, "I am a lover and a seeker, and I look only to love and to seek." And Vincent answered him, "It is well with you also, since you are come hither, for you shall love that which you desire not, and seek that which you have never seen." Then he led them down toward the city, and as they went they were astonished that he should so have met with them in the nick of need. But Vincent said it was no marvel, for that every day at the time of twilight it was his custom to come forth out of the city and walk abroad, to the intent that he might lead in any that were forewandered. So they came to the gate and passed in with him, and he brought them through the city to a house where they should be lodged, and they supped there within the hour. And while they sat at supper, they spoke of all that had fortuned to them, and Vincent heard them and answered them comfortably, as a doctor will answer them which are diseased. But of that which he said, Ywain heard not the half, by reason of the bells which continued sounding above the city, for the sound of them wrapped him about, as it were, with softness and with sleep. And his weariness became pleasant to him, and his thought a dream, and he desired nothing else but to hear those bells continually, both by night and by day. And so it fortuned to him and to Bartholomew, for this was the manner of the city whereto they were come, and when it was showed to them, they received it to their joy and solace. Then might you have seen them rising lively from their beds, and going forth under morning mist to keep the daily ordinance, for though the city was thronged with all manner of folk, yet there was but one and the same rule for all, and they rang bells at the point of day, and again when they had broken fast, and they rang before noon and after, and at evening and at midnight, so that they went never an hour without ringing of bells in some part of that city. And they took all their delight therein, and when they met together, as at board or bench or whatsoever doing, then they would have their converse of bells, and of the comforts they took thereby. For they supposed that the properties of bells were many and diverse, and they heard one bell for courage, and another for meditation, and one for ruth, and another for gladness, and the deepest they heard for fellowship, seeing that the sound of it was very great, and came into every house, both near and far. And in sum, the life of those which dwelt in that city was all to ring bells and to hear them, and to do no other thing, and therefrom was their sustenance and their repute. So Ywain went daily a-ringing with the rest, and he lived as it were by sound alone, and thought to have found peace, for his sorrow was rocked continually as a child is rocked in a cradle, and his soul was stilled as with a lullaby. Chapter 26. How Ywain found his lady in a garden. Now in this drowsyhood was Ywain living well content, and the winter passed over, and the year began to stir again from underground. And March came with dust and dryness, and then came April with sweet showers to pierce that dryness, and in the gardens the small birds were a-pairing and a-nesting busily. But Ywain was still assotted upon bells, and his mind was subdued unto the tune of them, for he forgot neither his love nor his seeking. But when he should have wept therefore, he remembered them only as an old and tender tale, or as a picture of one aforetime living but now departed, where is neither hope nor striving. So on a day he walked alone in a garden of the city, and heard a sweet sad peal of bells chiming, and mused pleasantly thereon. Then suddenly he came upon a lady that was standing on a sward of daisies, and she stood between two laylock bushes, a purple and a white, and gathered flowers of each. And her face was turned away from Ywain, but his blood moved at the sight of her, and he heard the bells no longer for a singing that was in his ears. Then the lady looked down upon the flowers that she had gathered, and Ywain saw her face athwart over her shoulder, and though her eyes were hid from him, yet he saw well that she was his own lady, for he knew her by the turning of her neck, and by her hair, and by her ear that was like the hollow of a shell. And beside all these he knew her by a reason that was no reason but certainty. And he spoke to her by name, and she turned about and looked at him. And he said no more, for he was astonished dumbly, like a man awakened out of sleep. And she said to him, "Tell me somewhat of your amazement, for what came you hither seeking, if it were not that which you have found?" Then he stood before her stockishly, like a thing of wood, but in his heart he went out of himself and kneeled upon his knees before her. And he said, "Forgive me, for I thought to find you, but not here." And as he spoke, there came into his mind the remembrance of the Queen of Chess, and of that old dame among the maidens, and of the herd girl in the wood of Howling. And when he saw his lady here also, and in her proper shape, he was bewildered suddenly, and he looked at her as at one that was past his understanding, and he cried out as in fear, "What are you, verily?" But she looked at him kindly, and her voice came to him as from a far distance, and she said, "How shall I tell you that which I know not, seeing that I have been many things in many times?" And he looked at her again, and saw her strangely, as a man may see his own home by moonlight. And he cried out, "Ah, lady mine and not mine! For as I think, you were a rose in Eden, and a golden child in Babylon, and a rainbow in Arcady, and a moonlight shadow on the walls of Troy. And you were loved of Tristram and Troilus, and for you Lancelot fought, and Sigurd rode the fire, and the sons of Usnach died." And when he had so said, her voice came nearer to him, and she spoke yet more kindly, and she said, "Yet for all this I am your lady and your earthly friend, and I have chosen you to my servant and my fellow pilgrim." Then she smiled and said further, "But there is no pilgrim that can live by sound alone, no, nor by ordinance of others." Then he said quickly, "Must I forswear all bells for ever?" And she answered him, "Not so, but I shall show you reason." And she put forth her hand and showed him the flowers which she had gathered. And she showed him first the purple, and she asked him, "How name you this, and of what colour?" And he said, "It is laylock, and the colour is the colour of laylock." Then she showed him the white, and asked him again the same question, and he said, "This also is laylock, but the colour of it is white." Then she looked gladly at him, and a little mocking, and she said, "You have well named them both, and in like manner the life of men is the colour of life, but the life in this city is white. And though it be life after a sort and sweet enough, yet is it no life for a man. And if it please you, we will take counsel together to depart from it, for we must still be going, if we are to achieve our pilgrimage. But the time is not yet, for I come and go whither and whence I will, but you are bell-bound until the moon shall change." Chapter 27. How Ywain was bidden to an abbey, and so to be entrapped by treason. When Aithne had so said, she stood looking upon Ywain, and her face was troubled, and her soul looked out of her eyes patiently, as it were one waiting for the dawn. For she was but newly come from Aladore, and she remembered as of yesterday how her mother had spoken with her before her death. And of Ywain she knew well that he was in good truth her friend and her lover, but for the rest she doubted, and in especial whether he were of one kind with her, that they might dwell together and find no division. And Ywain looked upon Aithne, and he also was troubled, but after another fashion, for he doubted not of her, but of himself. So they stood looking on the one part and on the other, and they knew not how for all their doubting their spirits were already handfast, and devising of fellowship together. Nor they knew not what was being contrived against them and against their pilgrimage, for they talked as they supposed in secret, but in secret also they were betrayed. Then suddenly there came a little noise of rustling, as of one that went by stealth among the laylock bushes. And Ywain started and strode forth and looked along the garden, and he saw a man going hard away from him, and no other near that place. Then he would have followed after him, but the going of that man was marvellous, for he went not by leaping but by creeping, like a lizard going among grass. So Ywain came again to Aithne, and told her of that which he had seen, and they laughed thereat together, and Ywain was a little shamed and thought no more of it, but Aithne laid it by, for she perceived that there was treason. Then they went out from the garden, and so departed slowly each from other, and they made promise to come together day by day until the third day thereafter, for on the third day at night was the time of the moon's changing, when they should escape out of the city of saints. But when Ywain thought thereon, he could not tell how it might be compassed, and he doubted not without reason, seeing that he was still in subjection. For when he was together with Aithne, he heard only her voice and nothing else. And when he was gone from her, then perforce he would follow the usage of the city, and hear bells to his pleasure. Now on the morning of the third day, when Ywain was not yet gone forth, there came in Bartholomew to speak with him, and he bade Ywain to a bell ringing in a certain abbey of the city, for he showed him how it was that night the festival of the Golden Bell. And he said how that bell was rung but once in the year, upon a solemn watch night, and men were bidden thereto by no common favour. Then Ywain answered Bartholomew gladly, and was accorded to go with him. Then in the same moment he remembered Aithne and the words which she had spoken, for this was the night when the moon should change, and he would have made excuse to forsake the festival, but Bartholomew held him strongly thereto. So Ywain left him alone and went to seek his lady. And when he had met with her, he told her all, and she said to him, "This is the treason, for he that devised it is the same which heard me say how you were bell-bound, and the snare is the festival, and Bartholomew is the decoy. But he that sent him to you is some greater one, for it is he that has bidden you both." Then Ywain said, "It is Vincent, for he brought us in hither, and he crept upon us so in the beginning, as a cat creeps upon young birds at the dusk. And it will be hard for me to escape from him, for he is of great power in the city." But Aithne smiled a little and said, "A great power and a strong magic, yet it may be that there is a stronger, and the trial shall be between him and me, for before the moon changes I shall be gone into the lost lands of the south, and I bid you to my tryst, as he hath bidden you to his." End of Part 9. Part 10 of Aladore by Henry Newbolt. Chapters 28 to 30. Chapter 28. How the moon changed, and how Ywain broke forth from the city of the saints. So when the evening was come, Ywain and Bartholomew accompanied together, and they went through the city darkling, for the moon was now in umbrage. And when they came to the abbey where was the golden bell, they found a crowd gathered thereabout, and the gate very well guarded. And within the gate was Vincent with certain others, and there was a great lanthorn above. And when they came beneath the light of the lanthorn, Vincent saw them who they were, and he greeted them and brought them to the chapel. Now the manner of the chapel was this, and it was by repute as proper a chapel as any in that city, for it was thrice as long as wide, and the roof was of white stone, high embowered, and carven with spreading ribs. And the walls were of white stone also, but overlaid below with cedar wood, and the wood was ancient and empannelled with many rich devices. And upon the walls were canopies with carven tracery above, and stalls of dignity thereunder. And below the stalls were other stalls, and again other, so that there were of them 3 several rows on this side and on that. And they which sat therein were set over against each other. And beside every man in every stall there was a fair white candle burning. and with the light of those candles the whole place was lit and glorified. Yet there was a darkness also within it, for the cedar work was well nigh black with ancientry. Also the floor was of marble, lozengy black and white, and in the candle shine it glimmered sombrely. So they came within the chapel, and Vincent showed them where they should be seated, and Bartholomew he showed a seat among the lowest, but Ywain he set in a high stall beneath a canopy among those which were great ones in the abbey and in the city. And when he was come to his place, Ywain looked adown the chapel, and he saw how Vincent had bestowed himself, for he was set fast by the doorway on the one side of it, and on the other side was set the Lord Abbot in his state. Then when all men were in place, the doors were closed, both the outer and the inner, and the Lord Abbot gave command, and the golden bell began to ring. And at the sound of that bell, the hearts of all that heard it were comforted exceedingly, and they folded their hands to rest, for that which they heard was as a sweetness poured out upon all things, whereby the wrongs of men were hidden, and their crying drowned. And Ywain also forgot in that instant all the ills that he had suffered in all his life. And of the morrow he dreamed without desire, for the fights wherein he had made forfeit, and the hopes which he had never achieved, he remembered them but with tenderness, as shames and perils of childhood, nothing great. And in likewise he thought carelessly on all that was to come, and he knew not how long he sat there musing, for the blood lulled idly in his pulse as the sea-water lulls before the turning of the tide. Then upon a sudden his eyes opened, and he beheld a marvel, for over against him there came upon the air the semblance of a man's hand, and the hand was great and black, and habited in a manche of black, and it came slowly along the chapel, by no motion that might be perceived. And as it came, the lights perished dead before it by stall and by stall, and the lowest row were those which perished first, and then those next above them, and last of all the lights that were before the canopies. And Ywain knew not what had befallen him, for he felt in his heart a lifting of heaviness, and he looked about to see his fellows. And when he saw them he was astonished, for they started up stiffly, and yet they moved not, but they sat every one in his place, with his eyes staring, and his mouth misshapen. And the hand went towards Vincent and towards the Lord Abbot, and their lights also perished, and the bell clanked brokenly and fell to silence. Then came upon Ywain both memory and understanding, and joy leapt from within him fiercely, as the tide leaps beneath the wind. And he rose up and made to go forth, and they that were near him clung about him and entreated him, for they were in terror of darkness. And he tossed them from him, and came striding to the door. And Vincent cried out that all should stay him, but Ywain said, "Let be, your light is out." And he smote him endlong, and went on, and left him lying. And he came forth to the gate, and burst it, and the crowd stood without, wondering. And Ywain saw them as a city of sluggards and slumberers, dead before their time. And he cried, "The moon is changed!" And he went through them, as the wind will go through standing corn, and by what way he knew not. He came to what gate he recked not, and he smote the porter with his own keys, and went forth shouting into the darkness. Chapter 29. How Ywain came into the lost lands of the south, and of the 3 signs whereby that country might be known. Now Ywain had in his going but one only intent, and that was by reason of his lady's word that he should find her in the south. So he ceased from his running and his shouting, and he looked upon the stars, and under the herdsman he found the south, and made to go thitherward. But he went not by the way of the high road, for he supposed that Vincent and his would raise hue and cry after him. So he left the road and climbed forthright upon the foothills that were hard by the city. And as he had supposed, So he saw it come about upon the road beneath him, for there issued suddenly out of the gateway both lanthorns and torches, like a scattering of sparks out of a chimney. And they which bore them ran hither and thither both up and down the road, bawling and babbling in the worst manner, for their voices were harsh to hear and out of all tune of bells. And Ywain sat above and beheld them unaware, and all their fury was by reason only that one had forsaken their ordinance. Then he left them to their hunting, and climbed further above the foothills, and he went all night to the southward by starlight only. And when the cold of dawn was past, then the sun shone warmly upon him, and a shepherd gave him milk and bread to break fast, and he lay long thereafter in a hollow of the hills. And about him was much blossom of wildflowers, and upon the blossom came 1,000,000 of bees, some great and some small, and every one of them droning busily upon his bagpipes. And also below that place was a meadow of sheep, with many lambs bleating. And Ywain had joy of those beasts, and of their droning and their bleating, for whether he slept or wakened, the sound of them was in his ears and in his blood. Then at the dusk he set forth again, and so he went 9 nights and days, for always he voyaged by night and slept by day, because of espial. But on the 9th night he came into the lands which Aithne named to him, for she named them the Lost Lands of the South. And when he was come therein, he knew them by a sign, and the sign whereby he knew them was the 3rd of 3. For when he first came into those lands it was evening, and not long past moonrise. And notwithstanding that all day he had taken joy of the sun, and of the noise of beasts and birds, yet now he had no less joy of the coolness and the silence. And he strode forward upon the shoulders of the hills, going swiftly and strongly, for the moon was now waxing fast, and the light of her lightened the green spaces of the grass. Then as he went, his eyes also were lightened, and he saw the world anew, for he perceived how that the beauty of it was no fading excellence, but only by long time forgotten, and belike remembered again, and again forgotten many times, according as men made clean their hearts or darkened them. And he saw that land as a land of gods, and not of men only. And though he saw not the gods nor heard them, yet he perceived plainly both their radiance and their breathing. Then in his joy he gave thanks to the moon, as to the Queen of Heaven, for he knew no longer what he did. And immediately he saw before him an upland all hoar in moonlight, for upon the sides of it there was a semblance as of mist rising. Yet was that semblance no mist, for it moved swiftly without wind, and Ywain looked again and saw it as a company of maidens dancing together, and their attire was all of cloudy silk, and their feet were bright as with 10,000 dewdrops, and their hair was whirled about them like wisps of smoke. And it seemed to Ywain that they danced so lightly as no thing living, save music only, for that will dance lightly without sound in the imagination of the heart. And Ywain knew not the dancers, nor how they might be named, but I suppose that they were of the hill maidens, which were of old time called by the name of Oreads. And it is like enough that they which he saw were the same, for their beauty also was of the earth, but nowise transitory. And Ywain beheld their dancing gladly, and kept no count of time. For as he stood, the moon passed over him, and went southing, and he marked her not. But at the last they danced more quickly, and with the sight of them his blood began to work, and he endured it not long, but he went running towards the upland. And as he ran, the maidens whirled them thrice in the air, and so sank down. And Ywain saw them no more, for the earth received them, and the hill lay bare before him. Then he took his way southward, and looked again upon the moon. And the silver of her beam was faded, and the sable of her shadows, for she was well nigh drowned in dawn. And when the day was risen, he began to go more wearily, for in those lands the sun was nearer and bore hard upon the wayfarers. And within a fair mile he saw a wood before him, and the wood was full of great ilex trees, with laurels shining about the margent of it. And he devised to go therein by reason of the shade and coolness. But when he was come thither, he clean forgot his weariness, and he perceived that the wood was no lonely place, but full of magic. For when he looked, he saw nothing stirring, but when he looked not, then always he perceived a stirring or a flitting or a vanishing on the one side or on the other. And he walked no more freely, but warily, by reason of the eyes and ears that were about him. Yet he saw neither eyes nor ears to give him reason. Then at last he came again to open ground, and he laid him down upon the edge of it within the shadow of the wood. And he took his rest and thought to be there alone. But within a while he returned into his restlessness, for he heard a sighing as of a little wind that came quickly and went past him, and so along the hillside upwards. And in the passing of the wind he saw as it were 3 damsels running swiftly one after another. And as they ran, his eyes were dazed with the beauty of them, and his wit stood still, and the whole world moved about him. And he got him to his feet, and laid his hand upon his eyes. And when he had covered his eyes, then he remembered how he had seen those damsels plainly, for they were tall and slender of form, and clear brown of colour, and they were arrayed all in green and gold, like young boughs in sunlight. Also they ran smoothly, as a full river will run towards a weir. Then he lifted his eyes, and looked again, and he saw them, and saw them not, for the place was still, and no thing moved upon it. But under the sun were 3 trees there before him, and the trees were, by seeming, 3 laurels windy blown. For they leaned a little forward, one after another, and their greenery went all one way, as it were streaming up the hillside. And Ywain supposed that in the dazzle of his eyes he had seen the trees and taken them for damsels. Yet he looked long upon them, as though perchance they were damsels indeed, and trees by semblance only. So he went forward pondering, and this time also he knew not that it was a sign which he had seen. Then he began to leave the high hills, and he came into a little downland with downs that tumbled diverse ways. And it was a bare land, but warm and rich, and in the valleys were cots with corn about them, and rivers going softly in deep meadows. And as he went he saw before him a beechen grove with 7 trees therein, and the grove was lonely and clear of boscage. And it seemed to Ywain that he had sight of children playing between the trees. So he came nearer, going slow and craftily, and he stood behind the endmost tree and looked through the grove, for it was but little. And that which he saw was passing strange to him, for the children were there before him, and the like of them he saw never in all his days. Naked they were, and manlike to the middle, in their flesh fat, and in their countenance all merry babes. But below they were of another fashion, for their hams were wool-begrown, and they were goat-kneed and goat-footed. Also their hair upon their heads was woolly, and their ears were pointed, and a prick like little horns. And it was plain to see that they were kin to the beasts, and all of them well understanded. For one child held a squirrel between his hands, and the squirrel feared not, but kept his tail a-high, and one sat piping to a company of small fowls, which also sat and piped to him. But there was yet another child fast by, which vexed the piper with a barley straw, and he ceased not for his brother's frowning, but tickled him evilly amidst his ear. Then when Ywain saw those babes and their playing, his thoughts left him, and forgetfulness and joy came upon him very suddenly, and his heart was delivered of a great laughter, and that laughter went rolling forth from him, as smoke goes rolling from a fire of greenwood. And like smoke it was renewed continually, bursting thickly forth without end. And the children heard it and ceased from their playing. Yet it brought no fear upon them, neither upon the beasts that were their fellows. For the squirrel chattered and the small fowls piped more loudly, and the children also wantoned in laughter, and rolled upon the ground together. And when they came upon their feet again, they spied Ywain and cried out joyously upon him, and they ran against him with their heads and blethered after the manner of kids. And when Ywain felt the butting of their heads and the busyness of their hands about him, then there came before his eyes a haze of brightness, so that he saw the world as it were golden and gleaming, and it seemed to him that he had returned into the morning of his youth. Then, with his much laughter, his strength went from him, and for content he sighed, and so laid him down upon the ground. And the children sat them beside him, and tumbled one with another, and as they sported and tumbled together, it bechanced that one of them struck Ywain with his foot, and Ywain started a little, for the kick was notable. And he perceived right well the reason, for he saw again the child's foot, how it was small and hard like the hoof of a goat, and instantly his thought quickened that before had been sleeping, and he knew the land whereto he had come, for this was the third sign, and sign past doubting, howbeit the first two were also signs and plain enough. But what he perceived not by Oreads and by Dryads, that he learned easily by fauns, for of those he had but vision of the eyes, but with these there came also kicking of the flesh. Chapter 30. How Ywain had fellowship with the fauns. So Ywain lay there upon the earth, and his laughter ebbed from him, and he set him to gather his wits together, as a huntsman gathers his hounds that have been chasing over wide. And in part he gathered them, but not all, for it seemed that some part of him was beyond calling, and would not return. But of that he left thinking and was content, and his heart was emptied of all thoughts save three only, for he had great desire of eating, and of fellowship, and of dancing. And the sun filled him with strength, and the air quivered before his eyes, and he leapt up upon his feet. Then he looked down between the beechen boles, and saw where other two fauns came swiftly up the hill, leaping towards him with great leaps, and they were no children, but goatsmen grown, with little beards upon their faces. And he stood still to meet with them, for he knew not what their dealing might be. But they came joyously to him, and favoured him with their hands, and with their looks, and with their voices. And when they had greeted him, they began to lead him away into the valley, and Ywain went with them gladly, and the children followed after, lagging and sporting one with another. And as they went, Ywain beheld the grown fauns curiously, and he saw how one was by seeming older and one younger, as it might be 2 youths of 18 year and 20. Yet their faces were not two but one, for they were made after one and the same pattern, and they differed in no wise save in the hair of their beards. For of one the beard was soft and like the down within the rose hips, and of the other it was hard and like the beards of barley. But in their lips and in their eyes was nothing diverse, and Ywain saw them as a man may see one only face in 2 several mirrors. Also their voices chanted together tunably, like voices of young sheep in a flock. And they showed Ywain how they were called, for they pointed each at other, and so named their names. And the older one was called Panikos, and the younger one was called Paniskos. Then Ywain spoke their names and laughed, and he showed them his own name also, and he laughed again, for they used it strangely, bleating somewhat in their speech. Then, in the like manner, they showed him other words, and he learned of them easily, for they spoke of no far matters, but only of such as were according with his appetite. And in especial they spoke of eating and of drinking and of music, and also, as he supposed, of hunting and of sleeping. And though Ywain knew not yet what they would say concerning these things, yet he knew certainly that they spoke thereof. And he perceived their joy, and had fellowship with them, for he saw how they lived far off from carefulness and perplexity, and how their life was mingled continually with the beauty of the earth. End of Part 10.